We are super excited to be here today with Ayesha and Dean Sherzai. Dr. Ayesha Sherzai is a neurologist and the co-director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Program at Loma Linda University. She completed a dual training in both preventative medicine and vascular neurology and is also a plant-based culinary artist. Dr. Dean Sherzai is an MD and an MPH and is the co-director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Program at Loma Linda University, along with Ayesha. Dean trained in neurology and completed fellowships in neurodegenerative diseases and dementia, and is also in the final stages of earning a PhD. Through research and their extensive medical backgrounds, both Ayesha and Dean work to demystify the steps to achieving long-term brain health and the prevention of devastating diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and dementia. They're the authors of The Alzheimer's Solution, which was released in September of 2017 and has been taking the Alzheimer's and vascular dementia world by storm. All the profits of their books go to the Healthy Minds Initiative, whose mission is to better brain health through research, through education, and by mobilizing local communities. So thank you so much for being here today with us, Team Sherzai. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
It's so wonderful to be here with you, Cyrus and Robbie, and thank you for having us.
Absolutely. So, for those of you who are watching and listening to this interview right now, you might be thinking, well, why are Cyrus and Robbie interviewing neurologists? This is about insulin resistance, this is about diabetes. What does this have to do with neurology? And you're right, this summit is about preventing and reversing prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, but more importantly, it's about preventing and reversing insulin resistance, which is the underlying condition that negatively affects all blood glucose control, period, end of story. The Sherzais are with us today because they are world experts in how insulin resistance actually affects your brain, which is something that we've never talked about and covered in detail in previous online summits. So what they have to say today is actually mind-boggling, and that pun is intended. So let's start at the top. Could you guys just give us some fun facts here about the power of the human brain? How many neurons exist in the average human brain, and what type of computing power do we really have as human beings?
So the brain is, it's absolutely remarkable. It's much more than we had imagined. And for centuries, it was a black box to us. So we ignored it. We literally took it out of the healthcare system. We took it out of our mind, literally and figuratively. Everything was cardiocentric and outside of the brain. Yet the reality is the brain is just like every other organ, but much more so as far as metabolism, as far as vascularity, as far as immunity, in every sense. I'll get some statistics as far as the cellular level. The brain has 87 billion neurons. Now that's way more neurons than you need for daily function. The reason I say that is because we think we're conscious beings. We're not. 99.9% of the times we're automatons. Even behaviors that we think we're doing out of conscious will is actually repetitive habits that we've acquired that are layered on top of each other, almost like macro programs. Only very small proportion of the time are we able to really fully be attentive and focused on an activity. So we really actually need very much less than 87 billion neurons. Now that's what didn't blow your mind. Now these neurons can make a few connections each, or as many as 30,000 connections each. So we're talking nearly 1 trillion connections. Now the connections, each of them, are not just the source of one piece of information. Each of those connections can have multiple pieces of information. Now that gives you a computing power of 1 times 10 to the 50th to 1 times 10 to 100 power. I mean, that doesn't even compute, sorry, pardon the pun again, but so our brain power is remarkable. Now what's even more remarkable is how hungry this brain is. This little 3-pound organ, this gelatinous organ, that if you hold it in your hand, it almost jiggles like a jello. A little more solid than the jello, but still, it's gelatinous. It's 2% of body's weight, yet it consumes 25% of body's energy. That's remarkable. Now, we have bigger brains in this planet. the whales, the elephants. But as far as energy utilization, energy consumption, there's no brain hungrier than the human brain. The second hungriest brain is 10% of the body's energy. Now that's why we are here together, because metabolism and how hungry this brain is and how overwhelmed it is more important than the genetics or anything else. That energy utilization. Now this brain wasn't expected to live past 20 or 30 years. We were supposed to, run around, run away from saber-tooths, from lions, tigers, and bears, and then mate, and then die very soon, 30 or 35 or so. Not always in that order, but that's what happened. But we ended up living longer and longer and longer till now we are in our 80s and 90s. This brain, imagine this machine. If it was a computer, it would need like super cooling, nitrogen super cooling. It's been functioning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for 80 years. When we talk about the heart being a vascular organ, not even close. It should be ashamed of itself when you compare it to the brain. Just put a brain, they have these pictures now, they've denuded, they've taken out all the tissue from the head, and they've left just the vascularity of the brain. It is completely blood vessels. So it is a vascular organ, it's an immune organ, it's an energy organ. That's what we're dealing with. Its main problem is metabolism.
Wow.
That's
so he was not kidding when he said this information was going to be mine. Really. Okay, so let's get right into the topic of insulin resistance here and how that relates to this whole topic. So some experts refer to Alzheimer's disease as insulin resistance of your brain, or type 3 diabetes. So what connection does Alzheimer's disease have specifically with insulin resistance and diabetes?
Yeah, so just based on what Dean was saying, the vascularity of the brain and the energy hungry state of the brain can explain all of this. The reason why some scientists have come up with this term saying that Alzheimer's is a type 3 diabetes is because very early during the stage of Alzheimer's disease or other dementias, there is a disruption in metabolism in the brain. And they've been able to see that with imaging like PET scans. And there is low glucose utilization by brain cells. And as the disease progresses forward, there is more disruption in brain glucose utilization. And they found out that initially, or very early in the disease, the brain cells are not able to use glucose as a fuel properly. And peripheral insulin resistance have always translated into brain insulin resistance as well. And so there is a correlation between the two. Now, it's important to remember that Alzheimer's disease is not just one solid disease. People don't come to Alzheimer's disease because of, bad protein deposition. There's a protein called amyloid protein, and then there's tau. And deposition of these proteins have been studied quite often. And when there's excess of these proteins or abnormalities in protein deposition in the brain, that has been, equated to Alzheimer's disease. But people can come to Alzheimer's disease from the vascular side, from inflammation, from oxidation, and there's so many other processes as well. But, at its core, there is disruption in metabolism of the brain, and insulin resistance has a lot to do with it.
If you had to take two of the processes as being central or almost ubiquitous, it's inflammation at some point and glucose dysregulation at some point. And of course, people who have the glucose dysregulation, they come to it primarily from that point. But others, like, for example, traumatic brain injury. We see football players, we see people who have had traumatic brain injury. They start with inflammation, but that doesn't mean that they don't get insulin dysregulation. Actually, glucose dysregulation also comes as part of that as well, because it's a closed system. They all interconnect. Now, with Alzheimer's, up to now, everybody's general population thinks it's a point. At one point, you develop Alzheimer's. And that's not the case. Invariably, in every talk we give, somebody says, when do I know that I have Alzheimer's? I say to something very counterintuitive and uncomfortable. I say, you have Alzheimer's, as your neighbor does, and that person, and everybody in this room, including us. Meaning that it's not a point. It's a process that starts earlier, very early in life, and pushes you closer and closer to the precipice, or further away from the precipice, depending on what kind of lifestyle choices you make. And those choices actually either push you all the way to the point where dementia sets in, or Alzheimer's dementia, which is a type of dementia, or you actually pull yourself away from that edge and you don't develop it.
Yeah.
And metabolism and glucose metabolism is central to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And specifically insulin resistance and insulin signaling is very important when it comes to different processes in the brain. It's involved in these connections that are made between brain cells, in neuronal growth, in differentiation of the cells, in gene expression, in different metabolic pathways. So any disruption in glucose and insulin resistance signaling can cause damage to brain cells, damage to the connections between the cells, and eventually inflammation and oxidation and dementia.
And not just Alzheimer's, almost all neurodegenerative diseases, including Parkinson's, and some very exciting studies about treating insulin resistance and potentially slowing, attenuating, or even potentially reversing Parkinson's, early stages, have just been done. So it's exciting time to take another look at diseases that we took as if the brain is not the same kind of organ as other parts of the brain, of the body. So that's where we come from.
This is great. This is great. I want to go into a lot of detail here about insulin resistance, specifically, and how it affects, the glucose dysregulation in your brain, because this is a very, very, very misunderstood topic. And as you guys know, there are people that are saying the exact opposite story as you, as people in the whole food plant-based community, and they're doing it, and they honestly believe they have the answer. And so it's very confusing for people to try and understand exactly what they should put in their body in order to minimize insulin resistance. So the one thing that we've all seen is the ketogenic diet, right? You turn on the internet, you turn on the television, and you see health experts telling people living with diabetes that the ketogenic diet is actually the optimal diet, the optimal diet to prevent and reverse not only diabetes and cancer, and to lose weight, but also to prevent and reverse Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline. They make these statements. They say things like, oh, well, your brain is made of cholesterol and fat, therefore you have to eat a lot of cholesterol and fat in order to actually have an optimally functioning brain. Can you shed some light for our audience here living with diabetes as to, what is the truth? Talk to us about ketogenic diets.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's really frustrating for us, and it's quite unfortunate that people rely on internet memes to get their information about the importance of diet and brain health, specifically in ketogenic diet. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, to say that brain is made of fat, so therefore you need fat. I actually, speaking of memes, I made a meme like that, so sorry. Sometimes memes is the same thing as saying that the body is made of 70% water, so we need, soft drinks and alcohol as a source of water. It's not the same. It's the kind, it's the amount, it's the type, how it should, this is cynical. It's extremely cynical of some of these people, and some of them are supposedly scientists, and they know better. But what they're doing is actually trying to pick off on the most, as I call, the most dangerous human attribute, confirmation bias. People want to know that the fat they're eating and their chips and their meats and their cheeses, it's fine. People want to believe that. So if somebody gives them something like that, what are you going to gravitate towards? That. And it's extremely cynical when they say that. I mean, why does ketogenic diet work? Yes. But what does it work for, and how long that work? That matters. Something can have a short-term benefit. You remember that in the 1950s, people said that cigarette smoking, doctors actually promoted cigarette smoking as a form of lung therapy, as a form of weight loss, as a form of energy. Well, it did some of those, yes. But what about long-term? So I say that ketogenic diet is like a one-night stand. Let's talk about glucose and how it's metabolized. So as hard as glucose metabolism is in the body, in the rest of the body, in the brain, it's even harder because it has to get through the blood-brain barrier. This poor molecule, no, let's start actually earlier. Let's take it in its complex form. It's in a multi-chain glucose molecule that has to be broken down. Then it has to be absorbed. Then it has to go through the blood-brain barrier because it needs specific receptors. And when it comes to brain, the receptor system is not as ubiquitous and is not as consistent as peripherally. You have, in any case, you have GLUT1, GLUT2, GLUT3, GLUT4. So it actually goes through the blood-brain barrier. The ratio is not the same in the CSF, in the blood, in the brain as it is outside. So now it's there. Then it has to bind to a receptor. A lot of times that receptor is the main culprit, fat, is being blocked by fat indirectly. So it can't get it. Let's say that it does bind to the receptor. Then a cyclic AMP molecule comes in. Then another molecule. It's like when you date somebody and you go to their house and the father comes to the door with a shotgun. Then an uncle comes. Then he hands you off to the uncle. And then from the uncle, after you go through that scrutiny, then you go to the aunt, then to the grandma, after all of that, then you go to the mitochondria. Then it gets becoming even harder. Now you go through marriage and all that. So that's a lot of work, but that's how it's supposed to be. We saw this in Parkinson's studies. Just because you give a dopamine cell into the brain, it doesn't mean it works. It's the tonic release, and it's a phasic release, and it's the amount and the type. All of that matters. Same thing with glucose. The harder route is the way it's supposed to go into the cell. It doesn't cause inflammation. It doesn't cause amyloid deposition. Now let's take this thief of the night, ketone bodies. These small little molecules, they're slick. They're very slick. They don't have to go through all these pathways. They climb through the window because they're so small. They climb through the window. Forget about dating. Forget about meeting the father and everything. Initially, lots of satisfaction. This is so politically incorrect in so many ways, but it's okay. Let's go with it. And they're happy. There is there's the momentary joy. They don't even know each other and all of that stuff. And weight loss and then keto. Yeah, there's definite weight loss in ketogenic diet, and we know how that happens because the body uses the stores plus the water. So there's a false weight loss. There's actually increased energy. Why? Because the mitochondria quickly get a source of energy, an unnatural source of energy that boosts it up initially. But long-term, repeatedly, there's been shown in multiple studies, inflammation, glucose dysregulation, amyloid deposition. So short-term gain, especially not good in the brain because long-term it has significant effect. Why? This incredibly complex, powerful machine, way more powerful than any other organ in the body, the brain, requires a homeostatic process of glucose and energy deposition, not this fast ketone process. I don't know if that story made sense to the audience, but I like it.
These analogies make perfect sense, and hopefully people are going to remember this information now.
Yes.
So there's actually studies that show that long-term dependence on ketone bodies in your brain leads to increases the rate of amyloid deposition. Is that right?
So here it is. Although we are not a big believer of animal studies because 70 products have worked in mice models of Alzheimer's, but when translated to human, none of them work. And for many reasons, we're not big supporters of animal studies, but nonetheless, there are studies that have shown that what you just said. But there's definitely no study that shows that long-term benefits of a ketogenic diet on the brain. None.
And you have to remember, when they say long, it's not even a year. None of these studies are actually long-term where they have seen the consequences, the vascular consequences of a ketogenic diet. Most of the measurements are just short-term improvement in memory, which is most likely because ketone bodies serve as a fuel when the cell is already shocked and it can't really absorb glucose as a fuel.
Another analogy I give is, which actually ages me a little more than Aisha because she doesn't know about this analogy. For those in the audience who recognize the car Pinto, the Pintos, Ford Pintos, Yeah. So
Steven Cyrus and
Oh
Robin.
yeah, absolutely. I remember these cars for sure.
those were terrible cars. Terrible cars. Imagine putting a Pinto on nitro fuel for a year continuously. What's going to happen to it? Just because you call it nitro, just because it's got energy, it doesn't mean it's good. You know, so it has to be a stable source of energy.
It's going to burn the engine.
Okay, so this is all great. These are wonderful analogies. I really think it's going to help it stick for people. Now, we have another controversial topic for you guys, the consumption of fish. So a lot of people think that that's going to improve memory and brain function because it increases their omega-3 profile, improves that. So is this true or false?
So I'm glad you asked. When you look at dietary studies, Robbie, they always compare diets to a standard American diet. That's how it happens in population studies. So, you know, they pick a population, they get food frequency questionnaires, they have individuals fill them out to kind of get an idea of what they eat. And most people eat a standard American diet or a SAD diet. Every year a report comes out from the American Heart Association. It's like a progress report card of how well we're doing as a nation. And by definition, less than 0.5% of adults actually eat a healthy diet. That should give us a pause and a picture of how we're doing. And a good healthy diet is essentially fruits and vegetables and beans, legumes, nuts and seeds, and water. So that's how we do. So any diet is better than the standard American diet. When they've studied fish, they always compare it to Twinkies, to red meat and barbecues. And because fish has lower amount of saturated fats compared to red meat, compared to chicken, compared to all the processed food, it tends to be better. Remember, food is a spectrum. So everything is compared to something else. But has there ever been a study that actually shows that fish is better than lentils or beans or a whole food plant-based diet? No, there hasn't been any study like that. And we know the importance of fats. And, you know, just because fish has less saturated fat than meat doesn't make it better than a whole food plant-based diet.
So let me give you an analogy. Imagine your fish. No, I'm just kidding. There's more analogy. Enough analogy. So I'm so proud that Aisha actually published, and it's coming out soon, one of the largest studies, nutrition and lifestyle studies in the California teacher study, 133,000 individuals over more than 20 years. And one of the things that we were curious, and we were both, and she's the first author, was, you know, Mediterranean diet. When she was in Columbia University, the most risky they would go was Mediterranean diet.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is Mediterranean diet? What part of it is healthy? You know, there's a concept in statistics called factor analysis. You do factor analysis and figure out which component is the component that you can attribute benefit to. And when you look at Mediterranean diet, every Mediterranean diet, it's not the wine, it's not the cheese, it's not the olive oil, it's not the fish, it's the plants, seeds, you know, things that we talk about, whole food plant-based diet.
Yeah.
It's not the fish.
Yeah.
And in her study, a whole food plant-based diet, that component in a Mediterranean diet, if adhered to fully, reduce your chance of stroke by 44%.
There's no medication that does that. And
Not
this
even
is just
close.
diet alone, not even looking into exercise or stress management or anything like that. It's that significant.
This is the third leading cause of mortality, morbidity in America. And we found something that reduces by 44%. Yet butter is on the top cover of Time magazine and not this article.
Yes, and you know, when you look at clinical trials, you know, most of the clinical trials, they don't show that fish actually improves cognition. The components that have been studied are the omega-3 fatty acids. And we believe, again, because of comparison, we believe that it probably has to do a lot with its anti-inflammatory effects and that coagulation aspect that it affects more than the fish itself. It's the anti-inflammatory effects of the omega-3 fatty acid that kind of stands out.
And here we're going to get a little less scientific, and I hate when people extrapolate or even talk about anecdotes. You know, the whole coconut oil story is an anecdote of one. Yet in our study, in our book, we had an anecdote of 3,000 that showed a whole food plant-based diet reduced your chance of dementia
In our own
profoundly, But there were still anecdotes, so we actually recorded it as that, 3,000 people. So I'm not, but anecdotally, fish in the waters and the oceans, we only check 2 or 3 chemicals when we do check. Mercury, lead, and a couple of other things. But since the 1940s, we've added more than 40,000 chemicals. How many of those do we check? So I really think that we're really jumping ahead again, without any data that shows that fish is beneficial. But when patients come to us and they're heavy meat eaters, we don't, we're all about behavior. We say, definitely as a transition, if that's what you want to do, it's better than red meat. But we'd rather you go for the optimal, which is whole food plant-based diet. And we work towards creating that behavior.
Okay, this is fantastic. So while we're on the omega-3 essential fatty acid conversation, there's a lot of skepticism here that a whole food plant-based diet can provide an adequate amount of both EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid, and DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. Is that true, that a whole food plant-based diet is inadequate in EPA and DHA, and therefore is it necessary for people to have to supplement?
It's difficult. It can be achieved, but it's difficult. And it can be achieved under the most optimal conditions, which essentially means not taking any type of saturated fats, which is, in the world that we live in, for people who are, transitioning, it's difficult. And so what we do is we recommend a supplement. And there have been studies that, taking an EPA, DHA supplement is necessary, especially if you're going towards a whole food plant-based. But we recommend an algae-based supplement because of concerns for mercury and other toxins that are found in fish oil.
Two things have been associated, actually more than that, but in reality it's just 2. Some people actually associate low zinc levels and low iron levels as well as B12 and omega for people who are whole food plant-based. In reality, there's only 2 of them that are somewhat truly of possible concern, which is B12 and omega and DHA. But in reality, even those have been overestimated. And people who eat consciously and are aware of their diet and don't eat just carrots all the time and eat a more complex whole food plant-based diet, even in that population, you really don't have the problems of omega or B12 deficiency. But you have to be a little more aware and conscious of the complexity of your intake.
Okay, terrific. So let's talk a little bit about exercise. So aside from diet, how does exercise impact brain health? How much, how often? Give us some insight.
Wow. So while nutrition gives the right environment for the brain to grow, to thrive, and to heal itself, exercise is essentially the software that pushes the brain to make those connections. When we exercise, given the right environment for the brain, when blood flows to the brain, there is increase in synaptic density, or the connections between neurons. And there are different types of hormones, growth hormones, specifically brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. It's this growth hormone that just shoots up when you exercise. And they've done studies where even one session of exercise where you kind of grow tired and you break a sweat, your BDNF levels go incredibly high, and that actually is sustained over days, and that helps create those connections. When people come into our clinic and they say they exercise, we try to find out, first of all, what they mean by exercise, because the definition of exercise, particularly for brain health, has changed. It's no longer just walking around in your neighborhood. That's great, but it has to be a little more intensive. And so moderate to intensive exercise seems to be very, very helpful for brain health.
Study after study is showing, robust studies, prospective controlled studies that show that even brisk walk, which is my favorite 2 exercises, are brisk walk, significantly brisk walk, and bicycling, because of the low impact on the brain as far as movement within this. This brain, the soft gelatinous organ inside the skull, it's moving all the time. So if you're pounding it, it's not going to be good for the brain. So biking and brisk walk is my favorite, and the data shows that people who've done brisk walking for a protracted period of time, not only do they have a lower risk of dementia and Alzheimer's, as much as 40 to 48%. But their brains are bigger. But let's take it one step further. When they've done prospective studies, when you've instituted a significant aerobic exercise, such as a brisk walk, you actually grew the brain. Now, why is that significant? Let me tell you, because after the age of 20 or so, you start losing brain cells. Millions of brain cells by 60 or 70, but that's not that big a deal, but it's the trajectory that matters. But people who exercise at any age, not only do they stop the shrinkage, but they actually have growth of the brain. That's remarkable. And growth to the extent that it's visible by MRI.
Mm-hmm. Which is kind of a blunt tool, to be honest with you.
Yeah. So exercise is absolutely incredibly essential. Now, exercise, although it grows new cells, cell growth is not as important as because it's the connections. And connections happen at any age and by the billions. So when you exercise, you make those connections. And those connection trees are not just connection trees. Along with those connections, you have angiogenesis, means new blood vessels grow, new neuropili or tissue of the brain actually grows. So actually you see the hippocampus, these two areas that are for short-term memory, they grow. So that's why exercise is profoundly important. And there are three so far, and our favorite term in English language or phrase is, to the best of our knowledge today. Because I think it's the only true humility out there. A lot of people and groups and talk about humility, but I think it's false humility and it's hubris hidden in language. But science says, to the best of our knowledge today, which speaks to the fact that we're okay with not knowing everything. We are driven by the knowledge at hand, which is robust, repeatable, validated by others, and falsifiable. Cole Popper had it. So that's important. To the best of our knowledge today, there are three kinds of exercise that are important for the brain growth. And I think it's critical for people to institute this. One is significant aerobic exercise. And that is about 25 to 30 minutes, 4 to 5 days a week. So work your way towards. We love WTE. Work towards increasing, WTI.
Yeah.
So WTE is work towards eliminating, which is foods that are bad, slowly work it towards eliminating. WTI is work towards increasing. So start with 5 minutes of brisk walk, and 6 weeks later make it 10 minutes and work towards. So 25 to 30 minutes of significant aerobic exercise, 4 to 5 days a week. Second thing is, don't sit around. Because even if you work 25 minutes, 4 days a week, but the rest of the day you sit around, it negates that benefit. Mm-hmm. So get up, walk, have standing desk, stretch continuously throughout the day. The third one is a surprising one. Yeah. If you're going to do any strength exercise, it is
leg exercise. So there have been studies that actually show that people who have bigger legs, believe it or not, have bigger brains. They've actually correlated thigh girth, muscle, of course, not fat, muscle mass in thighs to the hippocampus. There was a twin study. So they looked at, twins, identical twins, which basically, who have the same genetic structure and background. And the twin that exercised and had bigger muscle mass in their legs actually had a bigger brain and lower risk of cognitive decline over the years. So if there is any exercise that you can focus on the legs. Squats and lunges work.
Yes, or biking.
Or biking.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Now, whenever something like this happens, there's a directionality question. Right. Is it the fact that they had healthier brains, healthier people, therefore they had bigger legs? No, actually, when they actually tested for directionality, if you worked out your legs, your brains did better. So work out your legs. So those are the three lessons for exercise so far, to the best of our knowledge today.
This is actually great because I remember when I was in graduate school, they taught us, and we would read some evidence-based papers that say that at approximately the age of 18, maybe about 20 or so, that you don't grow more neurons, that neurogenesis, that process shuts down. And from that point onwards, the number of neurons that you have is on a downward decline. And I used to believe that was the truth until I started reading the research that actually shows that exercise can promote neurogenesis. And once I read that, I was like, you know what? That actually sounds perfectly logical.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, to the extent that you can see it, and when I say this, it's profound because the whole brain is 3 pounds. And if you can see it on MRI at age 60, that tells you the power of exercise.
Okay, so let's talk about sleep. How does sleep duration and sleep quality affect your brain health, and how much sleep is ideal?
Sleep is incredibly important. You know, we used to work in Beverly Hills at Cedars-Sinai, and you know, living in Beverly Hills, you get this culture of people who are very into, you know, health and health promotion and prevention.
And something's a little off the beaten path as well.
Kind of, you know, on the other side. And, you know, you would get these people coming in with the detox of the day, and there would be questions about, is this a good detox? Is that a good detox? Is this a good detox? And you would get detox from every pore of your body. You know, I just don't want to go into the details, but, you know, we would tell them there's two true detoxification process for the body. Number one is water, because we're more than 70% water. And if you drink water, that's the best drink, and you actually help your body detoxify itself. And you have this detox machine, which is your liver, and it can help you. The second one is sleep. So it's incredibly interesting. When we sleep, our brain actually gets cleaned. There are these cells, the microglia. They're actually called the janitor cells. They get activated when we sleep. And they get activated and they go and start eating away parts of the brain that are not working properly, that are old, and that are garbage. So it just kind of goes and collects all the garbage around the brain. And so you essentially think better, and you function better cognitively when these microglia work properly. When we don't get sleep, or when we're sleep deprived, these janitor cells go nuts. So what they do is they start eating away the healthy parts of the brain. And that's why when people are chronically sleep deprived, like people who are shift workers, you know, nurses working in the ICU, or people who drive late at night, they actually have smaller brains. So sleep deprivation literally shrinks your brain. And the second function of sleep, other than cleansing it, is memory consolidation. So all of the information that we get every single day goes into a kind of a notepad. And then during sleep, this information gets placed in the right file, folder, and cabinet in the hippocampi, which are the areas of the brain that consolidate memory.
And the cortex.
Yeah, and so, you know, going into each and every stage of deep sleep allows this to happen. And when we don't reach those stages, the brain goes haywire. And there have been studies that people actually score poorly in their tests and their examinations if they don't sleep well. And this brain fog and cognitive decline ensues.
It's sleep. We call it restorative sleep. You know, part of our acronym neuro. It's R. It wasn't just to fit into neuro, although it was fortunate it did. But it's about restorative sleep, not just sleep. You can knock people out. You're a physician. You know, you can give propofol and knock people out, and or any kind of medication. But majority of the sleep medications, a lot of them, don't allow you to go through those sleep cycles. And if you don't go through those sleep cycles, including the REM, you're not going to cleanse. You're not going to consolidate memory. And over time, that's probably the most destructive thing. And then add one big sleep disorder. We think one that's underestimated, sleep apnea. And sleep apnea is not just alteration of sleep cycles, because it never gets to deep sleep, but it's actually lack of oxygen, the ultimate fuel. So that's another element that actually a couple of studies show that if somebody has sleep apnea, that increases your chance of Alzheimer's by 70% by itself.
You said sleep apnea increases your risk for Alzheimer's by 70%?
In a couple of studies, yes.
Yes.
Wow. And sleep apnea, correct me if I'm wrong, is something that is highly associated with either being overweight or having cardiovascular disease, if I'm not mistaken?
Absolutely, absolutely. Correct. Which in many ways actually points to the importance of vascular health for the brain. You know, we talk about the brain being an incredibly vascular organ. So when people have sleep apnea, what happens is you get deoxygenation or lack of oxygen globally to the brain. And that affects the different parts of the brain, especially the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory consolidation, because it's really, really susceptible to changes in oxygen level. And just imagine if somebody has vascular disease, you know, cardiovascular disease like atherosclerosis, which is narrowing of the arteries. Same thing happens. The brain doesn't get oxygen. The brain doesn't get enough blood flow. And that's why Alzheimer's disease and vascular diseases go hand in hand. So it's all about vascular health, and it affects the brain significantly.
I love this. I like the idea of thinking about Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline in general as basically being a vascular problem, because it really is. I mean, diabetes is a vascular problem. Cardiovascular disease is a vascular problem, and cognitive decline is no exception.
How could it not be if you're talking about the most vascular organ in the body, the brain?
Yeah, absolutely.
100%. That's a great call. Stress. You guys talk about both the necessity of stress as well as the detriment of stress, because a little bit of stress is a good thing, but a lot of it of stress is not necessarily a good thing. So can you help our audience discern a little bit between, what types of stress exist and what is beneficial and what is detrimental?
It's not so much about a little bit of stress or a lot of stress. It's not about quantity, about type. We actually have completely shifted and say that just focus on increasing good stress, because the real estate of mental attention is limited. And how you define or how you're defined by stress is limited. So if you have good stress in your life, it leaves very little room for bad stress in many ways. I'll get to that in a second. So good stress is the kind of stress that's driven by your purpose, that is challenging, that's pushing you, that has a direction, that has vector, that is timeline. These are the kind of things that you and I and all of us are doing. Running a program is done without stress. And you have to get off the program to make sure that the connections are good at any one point. You have to manage teams. You have to, in medicine, you have to go through medical school, which is not without stress. But you have to go to graduate school. That all of these things, or even forget about the education component. People who have complex jobs, the most protective thing for the brain, as much as we would like to say nutrition or exercise, you know what it was? Complexity of job. Because that is the kind of stress that actually makes the connections, that pushes the brain. So how you define the stress or how you are defined by the stress is critical.
It comes down to defining it.
Yeah, defining
perception.
Exactly. So if it's driven by your purpose, like I said, and it's not this run-on doldrum that's not time-bound, then you actually define it in the limbic system differently. And let me take you, this is very unique. We've actually written about this. So both good stress and bad stress starts in the amygdala and the limbic system, the part of the brain that deal with emotion. But around that place, you actually define it differently. So good stress, which is really pushing you, actually is consuming a lot of energy of your brain, but it's defined as good, goes to the hypothalamus, and from hypothalamus to the pituitary. It actually releases a complete different set of neurotransmitters as well as hormones in the pituitary, as opposed to bad stress, which is not yours, that's not time-bound, that's something that you're doing that you hate, goes to the hypothalamus, goes to the pituitary, and does a completely different thing. We call it the humoral immuno time bomb. And we know this happens. We know that cortisol goes up with bad stress. We know that adrenaline goes up with bad stress. We know that your immune system is altered with bad stress. Even your amyloid levels go up with bad stress. This has been studied where people actually were under stress, even short-term or long-term, they've measured these things. Whereas with good stress, your dopamine chemicals are altered, your oxytocin levels go up as opposed to your cortisol levels going up, and you actually start stabilizing your thyroid, your glucose and everything else because of that pathway of limbic to hypothalamic to pituitary axis. So to us, the most important thing is creating good stress in your life, because good stress, which challenges you, which pushes you, which is driven by your passions, actually makes those cells make those 30,000 connections. There is no other way to make those 30. Your brain it's not natural for your brains to just make 30,000 connections. It only makes those 30,000 connections or so. I'm just picking that number. It varies, of course, obviously. It only does that when it's under tension, when it's under good tension. The natural state of the brain is a low energy, calm state. So let me give you an example. The group that had the biggest decline in cognition were the ones that had a very challenging life, but then retired and they didn't do something for 1, 2, or 3 years. Their decline was the steepest. Why? Because that push, that challenge was no longer there. The cells withdrew. And with that came all the other stuff. So to us, a purposeful life that is challenging, that really pushes the brain is the biggest protector of the brain. And that's where the good stress and bad stress comes in.
Okay, so speaking of this topic of, challenging jobs and stuff like that, can you tell us a story about the London cab drivers?
Absolutely, that's a fascinating study. So, they wanted to find out the changes in the brain and changes in cognitive scores among London taxi drivers. Why? Because London taxi drivers go through this gruesome test to get their license. Yeah, pre-GPS era. Okay. Apparently, the roads in London, for those of you who have traveled to London, is painful. It's not New York where you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and everything lined up in logical system. It's like somebody just stuck a bunch of yarn on a piece of paper. There's no logic.
You just made some enemies in London. So
I love you, London. I love you guys. But your roads are horrible.
I love it.
So what happens is they actually go through this gruesome test, and they have to study for it for a very long time. And so they did an MRI, which takes a picture of the brain before and after the test, and they also did neuropsychological testing to check their memory before and after. And for those who passed the test and got their license, their brain actually grew, and their neuropsychological test scores got better. And remember, this is not in a younger population. This is 50 plus. So even in a population of individuals who are 50 and above, which, we don't necessarily make cells and connections after that particular age, their brain actually grew, which was incredible, which basically means that if you have that positive stress, if you keep your mind busy and you're cognitively challenged on a regular basis, the crucial areas of the brain that are responsible for making memory, that are responsible for your personality, decision-making, problem-solving, that actually gets better.
The NUN study was similar to this. I don't know if you guys know about the NUN study.
No, talk to us about it.
So a group of about 900 nuns dedicated their time, their writings, their body, their blood levels, everything over a period of time. This is in Northeast, Rush University and others, where they actually dedicated their time and everything to science, specifically cognition. And they took their, they all had writings and diaries.
Journals.
Exactly. Yeah. And then after they died, they all had autopsies, brain autopsies. And this is well studied, we talk about big universities that looked at their pathology appropriately and everything, and blood levels. So they saw a group of nuns that had significant Alzheimer's pathology by brain shrinkage, by amyloid levels, by all the neuropathology that you would describe as Alzheimer's. There's actually a whole process that, and there's accumulation of amyloid in that, but this is later on in the stage. Yet this group that had significant Alzheimer's pathology never manifested the clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's.
They were totally normal during life.
Cognitively, they were fine. Yet others who had much less Alzheimer's pathology, to almost minimal, yet they had full manifestation of the disease. Whoa, what happened here? This turned the whole table upside down. What was the difference here? So those who had pathology of Alzheimer's, yet they were protected clinically, yet those who didn't. So they looked at their writings. The ones that were protected from Alzheimer's, clinical manifestation of Alzheimer's, despite the pathology, their writings were much more complex. Their vocabulary was much richer. And they were much more robust. Yeah. And they had more complex daily activities. They lived more complex lives, as much as nuns do. And the ones that they did that were not protected and had minimal pathology yet manifested Alzheimer's had lower vocabulary and had
socially isolated.
Isolated. And this is not at the time of disease, even prior to all this. So what was evident was complexity of language, complexity of knowledge, complexity of life creates those connections that protect you despite the underlying, or a concurrent Alzheimer's pathology. So keeping your mind active through challenging, positive, or tension that is driven by your purpose protects you even in light of pathology of Alzheimer's. That's bewildering, and that's actually hopeful. So our message is usually when we tell people, it's, you know, some people say, "Oh, are you blaming people for all getting Alzheimer's because they didn't live a certain life?" I said, that's like saying somebody who had diabetes and got heart attack and we would blame them. It's not about blame. It's about giving guidance for the rest of us and all of us to live a certain way to push back the diseases of chronic aging. And it's very simple. It's glucose dysregulation or insulin resistance. It's lipid dysregulation that actually contributes to that a lot of times.
Absolutely.
Most of the time,
Yeah.
it's oxidation and inflammation. They're not separate. And how do you affect those things? Through lifestyle, nutrition, exercise, stress management, sleep, and mental activity. So when people sell their products or their vitamins, or they try to find holes in your life with these vitamins, or you're missing this, or you have these toxins,
Or particular diet.
particular superfood, it's incredibly cynical. It's selling a product. I mean, we always tell people we have nothing to sell. We have a bunch of vegetables that you can get anywhere, air, good sleep, sunshine, go walk briskly outside, and do something that is driven by your passion. Nothing to sell, but it takes more effort. It's a more complex approach, but it's actually the true approach, which we showed in our clinic in Loma Linda, the healthiest place in the world.
See, you know, I think one of the things that I like so much about your message is that simplicity is king. And I think a lot of the times, especially in the world of nutrition, we like to overcomplicate things. We like to drill down into minute little details and say, well, what about this nutrient? And how about this nutrient? And this study showed that when you increase this, you decrease this. And it gets to a point where it's just overly complex. But I think what you guys are saying here is that actually the most effective interventions for improving brain health and for minimizing your risk for Alzheimer's and dementia are actually the simplest interventions that human beings have ever known, right? Move your body a little bit, have a little bit of, positive stress, eat a whole food, plant-based diet, really keep you sleep. Like, these things are so simple that it's almost too simple. And I think that's where people get confused.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They think, oh, well, it can't possibly just be this simple. There's got to be something more complex. But what you guys are saying is actually, no, it doesn't have to be, right?
Yeah, people want to know if it's methylcobalamin or cyanocobalamin along with CoQ10, along with this, which deficiencies do I have and what is my genetic profile? Well, there might be a time in the next 10 years or so that we might get to that level of personalization. I'm not doubtful of that. I'm not one of those people who say, oh, we will never get to that. No, we will get to that. At this point, if anybody is telling you beyond the fact that your life should be whole food plant-based, exercise more, sleep better, they're actually extrapolating beyond data for a purpose because they're selling something.
One thing I've heard you guys talk about a lot, and again, it kind of goes along with simplicity, but also the complexity of how everything works together,
Yes.
The holism. So can you touch on that topic a little bit?
Synergy.
You're talking about synergy. So when we look at the different lifestyle factors that we just talked about, let's just take nutrition in general, because we were.
I wonder why. That's her
love talking about nutrition. I think Cyrus said it beautifully. Sometimes it's just too simple, isn't it? People are trying to look for some complexity, but it's not. And this concept of reductionism, of focusing into one item or one molecule or one vitamin at a time, is wrong, because it doesn't work that way. It's like, if you want to listen to music, you listen to different notes played together and it's a beautiful symphony. That's how food works. It's the synergy between everything that works together and actually produces the salutary effect. Same thing goes for lifestyle risk factors for lifestyle. You have to have good nutrition, but on top of it, you have to have exercise as well. There's this hardware software concept that Dean and I use. We talk about hardware. So nutrition, sleep, and stress is the hardware. You create this environment for your brain to allow itself to grow. And then with cognitive activity and exercise, which are the software, you push the brain to get better. And it has to be multifaceted. It has to be comprehensive. Otherwise, you're going to get only a small portion of that positive effect in your life.
Yes.
Got it. So can you guys, one of the things that we'd love to know here is the dietary recommendations, just sort of as a global sort of suggestion here. Somebody comes to you, they say, hey, listen, I'm looking to improve my brain function or optimize my brain function, and they may or may not already be experiencing cognitive decline or, reduced brain function. So can you kind of give us a quick sort of 30-second elevator pitch for what type of generalized recommendation you would give to somebody in that situation?
Yes. I would say start with creating a purpose in your life, something that really drives your life. Then start building around that, because if you don't build around that, it's ad hoc. It's the New Year resolution. It's the diet of the day. It's the activity of the day. When there's a central process driving you, then everything falls into place. As far as food, is very simple. Work towards eliminating saturated fats. As far as exercise, work towards increasing your aerobic exercise to the extent where you get tired and short of breath. As far as sleep, work towards getting beautiful, restful 7 to 8 hours of sleep without medication. And most importantly, challenge your brain continuously around your passions, like playing musical instrument, learning a language, running a project, things of that nature.
I can't top that. That was good.
Wow, that's excellent. Yeah, it really is just that simple, and I love the message. I really do. I've seen you speak twice in person. Once at the Plant-Based Nutrition and Healthcare Conference last year in 2017, and then this year at the ACLM conference in 2018. And I remember the first time I heard you guys speak, there was this feeling inside of me. I was like, wow, these guys are brilliant, first of all. I love the fact that they're extending the whole food plant-based message to an organ that most people don't really talk about. Right? There's a lot of research about cardiology. There's a lot of research about diabetes, but there's not as much information about Alzheimer's disease and the brain. And then the second time when I heard you guys talk at the ACLM conference, I made sure that I had a pen handy, and I wrote 3 pages. I was just scribbling down as much information as I possibly could. And the information that you guys brought to the table this year, I thought was even better than it was the year before. And again, it focuses on this idea that it can be simple, it has to be simple, and that your brain is not operating in isolation from any other tissue in your body, right? Your brain is not, even though it behaves differently, the inputs that actually improve its overall function are very similar to the inputs that improve your heart, that improve your liver, that improve your pancreas, that improve your muscle tissue. Absolutely. And so, that's a long-winded way of me saying thank you for doing the work that you guys do. Thank you for improving the lives of thousands of people. Thank you for doing the primary research that's moving this field of Alzheimer's disease in the right direction. And thank you for teaching people the truth about whole food plant-based nutrition, because like I said earlier, there's so much confusion out there. And there's so many people living with diabetes and prediabetes and insulin resistance are searching for an answer, a way to improve their overall health. And I think what you guys are doing is really connecting the insulin resistance puzzle with your brain, and nobody else is doing that. I really appreciate all the hard work that you guys are putting into this.
Thank you so much.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for what you're doing, both Cyrus and Robbie. You guys are true public health warriors, because Dean and I believe that there's a lot of data that suggests the simplicity that you were talking about, Cyrus. There's a lot of data that shows what really helps us prevent devastating diseases like Alzheimer's disease and the risk factors, diabetes and high blood pressure and high cholesterol, that are associated with Alzheimer's disease and stroke and others. But it's a confusion in the language and the confusion in the message out there. And for you guys to take that message and create it and put it out there in a palatable format so people can understand and get rid of that confusion is incredible. So thank you. And we're so happy to be connected with you.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to have you guys participating in our summit, meeting you guys and talking to you guys. It's just
Pleasure.
awesome.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.